Hello, I'm Alex Tahk, the director of the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership. Thank you for joining us today for what I think will be a fascinating conversation with the former Prime Minister of Estonia, Mart Laar, on public leadership in Estonia under Soviet rule and after Estonia regained its independence following the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is the first in a series of discussions on Cold War leadership in the US and abroad, and I hope you will consider joining us for more of them. For those unfamiliar with the Thompson Center, the center was established to follow in the legacy of Governor Thompson. Our primary goal is to determine how we can produce and facilitate effective public leadership, like that of Governor Thompson. Based out of UW-Madison, we work to further this goal by offering events, funding research and scholarships, and conducting other activities across the University of Wisconsin system. As part of this, we are currently soliciting proposals for speaker and research grants, and I encourage anyone affiliated with a UW school to consider applying. For more information on our upcoming events, grant opportunities, and other aspects of the center, please visit our website at thompsoncenter.wisc.edu. This event is also brought to you by the Center for European Studies at UW-Madison, who have been wonderful partners on this and other events. The executive director of the center, Elizabeth Covington, joins us now. Elizabeth?
Hi there. Thank you so much, Alex. I just wanted to say very briefly today, we're very excited to have this working partnership and collaboration with the Thompson Center on Public Leadership, and especially when we can invite guests, illustrious guests like Dr. Mart Laar, who not only is the former Prime Minister of Estonia, but we just learned a few minutes ago is an archivist along with resistance work, simply an amazing biography, and we're very proud to take part in this. Just a few words about European Studies at the UW-Madison. We have had a working partnership with the European Union through its RELEX, its Directorate General for External Relations, and now through its Erasmus Plus program since about 1998. So we have watched countries like Estonia learn to participate in the EU project and throw their weight around eventually. And I'm sure we have a lot of information we're going to learn about the Estonian part of that today. So thank you so much, Alex and Tia, for making this work, and I'll turn it back to you. Welcome to all.
Thanks, Elizabeth. In retrospect, the collapse of the Soviet Union can sometimes seem inevitable, but this always seems to me to be a mistake. At a minimum, few perceived the outcome as inevitable at the time, or even likely as the events were unfolding. In reviewing the events leading up to the collapse, I find it all too easy to see how events could have turned out differently, as they have at other times and in other places. This leads me to believe that leadership played a crucial role. And I find leadership during this period even more intriguing when considering that many of these leaders not only would not have seen the outcome as inevitable, but could easily have faced terrible, even deadly personal consequences for their actions had events unfolded differently. Thus, I believe there's a great deal to learn about public leadership from this period. The Estonian experience during and after the Cold War is a fascinating example. Estonia, for those unfamiliar with it, is a small nation on the Baltic Sea. It is bordered by Latvia to the south, Russia to the east, Finland to the north, across the Gulf of Finland, and Sweden further to the west. Estonia's recent history has much in common with its southern neighbors of Latvia and Lithuania, fellow Baltic states. But Estonia also shares strong connections with Finland, with the Finnish capital of Helsinki lying only 50 miles from the Estonian capital of Tallinn, and closely related languages and history. Estonia also shares a connection with Wisconsin. At the start of the 20th century, when Estonia was not yet an independent country, 70,000 Estonian immigrants settled in Wisconsin, which has a similar climate to their homeland. In 1914, the first Estonian church in the United States was built by the Estonian American community around Gleason, Wisconsin, in Lincoln County. By that time, Lincoln County and neighboring Langlade County had the second largest concentrations of Estonians in the country. 14,000 more Estonian immigrants settled in Wisconsin under the Displaced Persons Act at the end of the Second War. Estonia became an independent nation in 1918, following centuries of rule by Denmark, Sweden, and the Russian Empire, and 4 years after the Estonian Evangelical Martin Luther Church was built in Lincoln County. After over 2 decades of self-rule, Estonia was invaded and occupied during World War II by the Soviet Union, then by Nazi Germany, and again by the Soviet Union. After the war, the Soviet Union retained control of Estonia and organized it into the Soviet Union. The Soviet annexation of Estonia was considered illegal by most Western nations, who recognized legal continuity of the Estonian state through a government in exile during Soviet rule. In the 1980s, Estonia's first major opposition movement, the Estonian Heritage Society, worked to gather a historical record of the Estonian resistance movement during the first decade of Soviet rule after World War II. In 1985, a history teacher named Mart Laar recorded the first accounts of the resistance movement from those who had experienced the events firsthand. That work ultimately culminated in a 1992 book by Mr. Laar, the English translation of which is titled War in the Woods, Estonia's Struggle for Survival, 1944 to 1956. It's a fascinating book to read, and I would highly recommend it to anyone interested. The events of the late 1980s and early 1990s that led to the restoration of independence in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are commonly known as the Singing Revolution, in reference to the role played by the singing of patriotic songs, which the Soviet authorities had tried to suppress. A March 1991 referendum of the residents of Estonia, including those who had immigrated from Estonia during the Soviet era, found 78% in favor in an election with over 82% turnout. On August 20th, 1991, in the middle of the attempted August coup in Moscow, the Estonian Supreme Soviet voted to proclaim the restoration of independence of the Republic of Estonia. Mr. Laar was one of the delegates voting in favor of that measure. As the attempted coup unraveled over the next few days, the Republic of Estonia was soon recognized as an independent state throughout the world. The first parliamentary elections after the restoration of independence were held in September of 1992. Mr. Laar led a 5-party bloc, the Pro Patria Union, whose success in the election led to it forming a coalition government with Mr. Laar as Prime Minister. As Prime Minister, Mr. Laar worked to rapidly transition Estonia to a market economy. His government introduced a flat income tax, privatized most national industries, abolished tariffs and subsidies, and produced a balanced budget. He also started Estonia on a path to its current position as a leader in global technology. Mr. Laar served as Prime Minister until 1994. He returned to the position in 1999, serving until January of 2002. This photo was taken 2 months after Mr. Laar stepped down as Prime Minister in January of 2002. This photo is from March. Mr. Laar is pictured here with a young American college student, me. I was working on my senior thesis on post-Soviet democratization, and I traveled to Estonia seeking interviews. Mr. Laar was one of several Estonian politicians gracious enough to speak with me. I've come up with some new questions for him in the 2 decades since. In 2004, Estonia joined both Nato and the European Union. Prime Minister Laar earned his doctorate in history in 2005, returned to politics in 2006, and served as Minister of Defense from 2011 to 2012. He has since retired from politics. Prime Minister Laar has received numerous awards and is often called the most influential Prime Minister of Estonia since the re-establishment of independence. Prime Minister Laar joins us now from his home in Estonia. Prime Minister, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for this nice introduction. I heard a lot of good news about me.
I want to talk both about the period under Soviet rule, the independence movement, and your time after the fall of the Soviet Union when Estonia regained its independence. But starting with the first period, the Soviet government sought to sort of suppress the ideas of Estonian nationalism or Estonia as an independent state. And in my understanding, even discourage the Estonian language in favor of Russian. The Soviet regime seemed to have pretty strong coercive powers. Why was that unsuccessful? How were those ideas of Estonian nationalism and the idea of Estonia as an independent state preserved over that period when they couldn't be expressed publicly and adopted by those like yourself who were born under Soviet rule?
It's one of the main questions now, because it's really hard to understand, because Soviets were quite successful to kill or deport to the Siberia nearly 1/3 of the population. So it's a quite big losses. And so Estonian population has not yet regained its size before those events. So we still feel all this pain. But then the Soviets, when they don't even kill the people anymore, then they try to destroy our memory so that we all forget the Estonian independent state, or even the monuments which we had were destroyed, all the books were destroyed, burned, and so on. But somehow, as there was still 2/3 of the people alive, they still had a memory, and through them, all this memory went on and on, even to my generation, and all the songs and even a lot of books were became available, because not everything was possible to destroy. The people hide it, the monuments, the people hide it, the books, the people continue to sing the songs, what they liked and what the Soviets didn't like, and even Estonian national flags, which were very strictly not allowed, blue, black, white flag. People just had this at home somehow in the hide. And when this time came, then suddenly all these monuments came back, were put back. All those buried stones were put back, and the flags also. So I think the memory was crucial, as we succeeded to defend our memory and fight for this. Then the Soviet system was beaten.
So you may have already answered some of this in that, but I've noticed that many of the leaders of the Estonian independence movement, including yourself, but also numerous others, were historians or had degrees in history. And the Estonian Heritage Society obviously has a historical focus to it. Why was it? Why were so many leaders historians, and was that important to the movement?
Probably it was connected again with these memory questions. So for us was maybe more easier to start. But when we look all those thousands of members of the Heritage Society, so they were not historians. They were just Estonians, because the same happened actually with everybody, because they knew something from the stories of their grandparents. They knew something of independence in what they have read from these books, what they have found, and they understood that this what they read in the Soviet books and newspapers are all very different and all lie. And when you are understanding that you must live in the lie and you want to live in the truth, then you must do something. And so it somehow worked together, historians as all other people.
So I mentioned, and you mentioned when we were speaking before this call as well, your work on the Forest Brotherhood with the Estonian Heritage Society and what became your book. It seems to me that studying the Forest Brotherhood, that is the post-World War II anti-Soviet resistance movement in Estonia, can be inspiring, but also disheartening if you're living under Soviet rule. The Forest Brotherhood was, of course, ultimately unsuccessful in its goals and thoroughly destroyed by the Soviet authorities with pretty terrible consequences for many involved. Can you talk a little bit about why the Estonian Heritage Society decided to research the post-war resistance movement in particular and the effects that research had?
When you start to meet with these people who are still alive, because some people came back from Siberia, of course, that was not in the Soviet plans, but the situation changed a little bit. So, and many people came back alive. And immediately when these people were ready to talk, and I was, as a young man, just very surprised when I understood how many people are ready to talk. And as the people themselves said, okay, what I can do? I am quite old. I have been once in Siberia. My wife has been in Siberia. What I can do? They will send me back there or what? And so they started to talk, and this information was for everybody, of course, very such a strong. And when you heard all these stories, there was no other chance as you just had to write it down and to publish it because the stories just demanded it.
At the time, in the mid and late 1980s, what was your expectation, and what was the expectation or possible outcomes that you and others in the movement saw? Did you see the collapse of the Soviet Union as inevitable or likely?
No, I was sure that it will collapse in one day, but I have strong doubts will I see it because all the system was very clearly collapsing, but I had strong doubts that it will go. Can it go so easily how it went? But my personal outcome, I mostly refer to my coming wife, who said that probably she will be the wife of the decapitist who will follow his husband in Siberia. And of course, this attempt was made with me because when I started to publish first all these stories, of course, the reaction was very strong from the Soviet side because they were still in power and they were still powerful.
So those involved in the movement in the Estonian Historical Society in the mid 1980s must have been aware that there was sort of personal risk to them, depending on how things turned out. And as I understand it, Soviet authorities brought criminal charges against you for your
Yes,
work with the Estonian Historical Society while you were abroad, perhaps hoping you would seek asylum elsewhere rather than return and continue your
yes.
work. You obviously didn't do that. Why did you choose to return, and how did those in the movement sort of deal with that concern?
Now, first of all, of course, my family was there, so and it has been easy maybe for me personally to just not return to the Soviet Union, but to ask political asylum from Sweden. So it has been not very difficult, but it has been like a small betrayal to my family because it was clear that they must stay in the Soviet Union, and then I will be not very happy in Sweden without them. And secondly, I was quite sure that the main idea to starting these criminal cases against me the main reason was that they wanted to stop my work. So we started just before it very large official collection of the oral histories of the people. And it was clear that the Soviet system hoped that when I am gone or I am in Sweden, then all this my work and all this collection will stop. And I decided that when I go back, I must, of course, support all these people who gave this information to me and to really encourage them to show that I will not escape. I will come back. And when they want to go give me to the court, then let's give me to the court. I will speak there. I have a lot of to speak. And of course, I was right because so many letters. What I got after this when I have returned to Estonia, in this case I have never got, and nearly after this collection of the memory, it was really got really significant growth, and many people were encouraged first time to write about their experiences.
So I wanted to ask what effect, if any, Western leaders had in the Estonian independence movement, especially in their the positions they took and speeches they gave related to the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan, who was president of the United States for much of this period, I think was particularly noted for being harshly critical of the Soviet regime. Were Estonians at the time aware of these things? Did they influence people in the movement in either a positive or negative direction?
No, actually, we were aware because, of course, as you said before, we had our community in the States, in Canada, in Sweden, and of course, especially in the States, all the congressmen and all other politicians were bombed with letters and with the petitions. And of course, Ronald Reagan started from this, where he became the governor of California, was very strong partner for the Baltic communities. Actually, quite large his staff in California was from among the Baltic communities. So we cooperated the exiled people there and Reagan administration very well. And through Voice of America and all information channels, not always, of course, because it was not tried to avoid those radio programs from the Soviet Union side, no, but it was still strong enough that we got the main information what's going on in the West.
So, moving forward a little bit to your time as Prime Minister, I believe when you first became Prime Minister in 1992, you were roughly 32 years old,
Yes.
far younger than most Prime Ministers around the world.
Yeah, younger of everybody.
Yes. You had been educated, lived your life under the Soviet regime. This doesn't seem like, to me, a sort of ideal background to have when tasked with leading a country, especially when wanting to undertake the sort of changes you were interested into the economic system. How did you approach that? How did you approach coming in with less experience than is maybe typical for that sort of position, and with the limited information that was available during the Soviet era? And what advice would you give to future leaders who might have sort of less than ideal experience when it's necessary for them to take on tasks?
Yeah, that's a good question, of course, but hard to answer. When I have tried to understood why at all I became prime minister, why people voted for me, then I understood at one moment that I really did look like Soviet, and I have had enough courage to stand against the system. And this word courage is one of the most important words for every prime minister, because when you have courage, you can really lead your country and nation. Or actually, I have strong doubts can any government or prime minister lead, but I can at least uh, give people enough freedom that they can live for themselves and lead themselves, and to move away lot of those problems what they have in this road. So I can really let them work and let them live and let them decide. And I think this is most important work for every prime minister. And never be afraid. That's most important.
So when Estonia regained its independence, you were left with an economic system. It was very much different from a market economy. Why did you want to make such a large change to it? I think, in many ways, as I understand it, the reforms you adopted moved Estonia to being more market oriented than much of Western Europe, and further to the right economically than much of Western Europe. I think many people would look at that sort of situation and think you should try to make smaller changes, move in the direction of a market economy, but maybe not something so drastic. Why did you think that approach was important?
Never try to do small changes. They will never work. So the reform something really, it demands very bold actions. And we were ready for bold actions. And we didn't care what would happen with us politically after those bold actions. Of course, with me, it's easy to talk with me because I was voted back after these bold actions. But for every other leader, I must say that's most important to really to be decisive, because when you have decided that you are starting to change something, then really do it, and don't hear all those so-called very clever people who will say to you that it's not possible, because you will meet a lot of them, and they are always wrong, because especially when you are in such a desperate situation where we really had nothing. The only thing what we had was the courage to be decisive and to really be bold, because otherwise we have not got any reforms done.
Estonia has developed somewhat of a reputation as a leader and an innovator in digital technology, particularly sort of e-business and e-government. Um, it was obviously not particularly well positioned for that in 1991. Your time in office, I think, began laying some of the groundwork for that, which has been continued uh, in the time since. But why is that something that you thought would be important, thought would succeed, and um, do you think that's been important for Estonia's development in the last several decades?
I think the first of all was for us important to understand where we were, and we really had really no basis for any so changes for new technology. We didn't have this. And when we didn't have fax machines and we even don't have fixed telephone lines, then we looked to the world and decided to make some leap, like the other countries like Taiwan also have succeeded to leap really from nothing to the newest technology. And so we decided not to have this stadium, what we saw in Europe with the old computers. We decided not to have this at all and to move immediately to the most newest technologies. And one of the first things what I did was to cut Estonia out from US IT programs because I decided and declared that the foreign aid leads only to the third world, because when you're helped by somebody, then it demonstrates that you are not capable yourself. And we wanted to do something ourselves. And actually, by example, a lot of Western aid in the first years from Europe was to send for us the old computers, but didn't need themselves. And I gave the order not to welcome them because we didn't have computers, of course, at all. But I decided that we don't want your old computers at all, too, and keep them yourself. And we want only the newest one. And we decided that better have less, but then really good. And so we built everything on the most modern technologies. And of course, we tried immediately to cut this digital divide between the people, between the old and young, and in schools and universities. So we really teached everybody and gave them possibilities and encouraged them to use these possibilities. And thanks to this, Estonia is really the country where 90% of the taxes are paid online, electronically. It takes approximately 10 minutes to fill your tax declaration. And we have the elections online and so on. And of course, not talking about the government, which works online too. So it's a big change, and of course it has encouraged enormous amount of young people to use this, building Estonia now for today is the country of unicorns. These are these most billion worth companies, and they are coming really not one in the year, but at least 10 in the year. And when you look at Estonian size, then we are probably the most active country in the world in this area. So, and of course, I don't list just startups because these are amount of them, because to become the unicorn, you need a lot of startups.
What do you see as the most important change after re-independence was established, or policy to set Estonia on the course that it's followed?
It's hard to say even one thing. Looking for current movement in my country, around my countries and this part of the world where I live, of course, I must say it's all this what's connected with build my country to the really solid ground. This is the integration to Europe and special integration to NATO. And we had to hurry up with these things because we didn't have any time to lose. And we're looking now what's happening around, then we are especially understanding how right we were to understand that we're having no time.
So you were prime minister in at two different points, uh, separated by a significant number of years. When you were prime minister for the second time, were there things you learned from your first run as prime minister? Were there things you did differently in your second time, or lessons you learned?
So no, not very much, because the main lesson was the same. You had to be bold, and I tried at least to be same bold in my second term as I was in the one first, and this was good attempt.
I'm sometimes struck even just as someone who witnessed these events from the US, that my children and even my current students weren't alive during the Cold War or the post-Soviet transition period in Eastern Europe. And these things play a significant role in how I, at least, understand the world. Perhaps this is unfair, but I see a younger generation, many of whom seem to me to see the Cold War as somewhat irrelevant ancient history. I don't know if this is quite the same in Estonia, but are there lessons from the Cold War to be passed on to our next generation? And how do we ensure that that happens, if so?
Of course, it's same in Estonia, and I am very lucky that and very happy that is so, because I think that's excellent that the people don't remember anymore how the Soviet Union was, because it was very terrible experience, and when they having the normal life, and it's really very very different from my youth age and youth time, then I can only feel very very happy. But on what we have to learn, we can just remember always that the history still matters, and especially when we look at the current world, I think history matters even more, because from the Cold War, I think it's important to understand that how it has worked during the Cold War and before it, and how the wars are starting. And in this sense, to understand that what is Russia, and how must not we can, I don't know, can we handle this, but how we can live with Russia.
So I want to move on to some questions from our audience, and we have several submitted already. And please, if you're watching, please submit questions in the box below this video. So the first question here: when you first became Estonia's Prime Minister in 1992, you appear to have been quickly established personal relations with many prominent Western politicians and political figures, for example, Thatcher and Bild and others. How did that happen? How did you do that?
Actually, that happened soon before, because when we started the build of our political parties, then just through these party ties and contacts, so I got contacted with them, and we got related, and even with some people I can say that we became friends. And it just happened because we found in some way that we were very similar. And of course, at least I learned a lot from them, because it's of course very valuable when you meet such of people more deeply, like Margaret Thatcher. Also, of course, I unfortunately didn't learn only good things, but I learned the bad habits also.
So, question here, Mr. Laar, how would you characterize the dynamic between the Russian-speaking minority in Estonia and the country at large? And in your opinion, is there any cause for concern vis-a-vis the Ukraine and the Kremlin?
Yes, there are two questions. Of course, the Russian-speaking part of the Estonia, there has been, we can say, also at the first years, even before my government, these relations were quite nervous and bad, because all these people who were colonized to Estonia in the Soviet times, they were afraid that we will handle with them in the similar way how Russians handled our people, the speeds to put these to the trains and then to the Siberia. And as they found quite quickly that we are not planning to do this at all, and we want to build our really integrated society, then those situations changed and has changed very much for today. So, for example, even when we during the Nato, we had to pass the referendum and so on. So quite big part of the Russian-speaking population of Estonia voted yes for NATO also. That was not the problem anymore. And of course, there is still work to a lot of work to do in the integration to really to give enough Estonian language education for the Russian-speaking people, because it allows them to really participate fully in Estonian life. And this takes time, probably still takes more time as I hoped and planned, but it's work what's going on. And even with all the possible problems, it's still really developing very clearly, positively.
So I think that also leads more generally to a question about.
Second question.
Yes.
Sorry.
Oh, yes,
Ukraine.
please.
I nearly forget the second one. Part of the Ukraine question,
Yes.
of course, even more in Ukraine, I must say. It's not the question of the Russians inside of Ukraine, but it's very much a question of the Russia or Kremlin, more or less, outside of Ukraine. And of course it can be the path of, you can say, I don't know what is in the Belarus, this house called where the Lukashenko sits, and that's both countries, both these are having problems with Ukraine, and Ukraine Russian population looks to be more and more unified. And one thing what Mr. Putin has achieved very clearly in Ukraine, which was the result what maybe nobody expected, was that Mr. President Putin has really created a strong Ukraine nation who is really ready to fight for the Ukraine.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask more generally about the role of language here. Both the Soviet authorities had obviously tried to encourage Russian, and after the independence, I think your government and other governments have adopted policies to encourage the use of Estonia. I also recall reading that the Soviet censuses showed a decline in the Russian-speaking percent of the population from the 1960s to 70s, and the historians I've talked to about this suggest that it wasn't a real decline, but it was a decline in the percent of people, percent of Estonians willing to acknowledge that they understood Russian.
This was
What
one
role did
census.
language play here? Yes.
This was one census where it happened, and of course, where the size of Russians were so large that to keep the Estonian Estonian spirit, Estonian opposition decide to suggest the people to answer his questions about knowledge of language that they don't know Russian, which large sometimes and very often was not true. But it really resulted with a visible drop in the Russian knowledge of Russian language in Estonia. But Estonian language, of course, during the Soviet rule was hunted in every way what was possible, and it disappeared from the official documents. It disappeared from the official speeches, and even events on the so-called socialist Estonia were held in Russian language. So it was very strong pressure, but of course it's not very easy to press the language, and we have decided to keep it, and we kept it.
Was keeping and promoting the Estonian language an important part of the path Estonia has been on, and it's
It has been a part of all the independence movement, of course. Maybe not the only one, but also important because at the beginning it was mostly such a passive resistance where the people just ignored the rules and orders and continued with the Estonian language everywhere. Sing and Estonian songs, the singing festivals were very important, but also when the Russification became stronger, then also the youth demonstrations were organized and youth revolts against the Russification policies and for support of Estonian language. And these were quite large events.
So I have a question here that says, first, thank you, Prime Minister Emeritus. Estonia is amazing. Can you please share more about your cybersecurity National Guard, meaning regular civilians or cybersecurity professionals helping defend your critical infrastructure? What more similar forces can and should the United States perhaps mobilize than our traditional National Guard as a maximum age limit of 40?
No, so far as I know, this cooperation is going soon. But I think when we build up our e-government, then one of the first important things was to really do from the beginning to look that everything is really protected. And so we must have to develop a lot of staff and a lot of people who know how to protect your government systems, because we run and decided to run very open government. And when we started to build the first model, we asked a lot of people and even were ready to pay for somebody who will really hack in there. Of course, nobody has called the money yet, but at least we have really developed and tried and learned. And when in 2008 Russia had the first large cyber attack, now it's a common thing, but 2008 was large Russian cyber attack against Estonia. Then we were more ready as Russia expected, because we had all these people who had been trained. We were one of the few countries in the world in this time who were quite ready, and we got a lot of volunteers around the world also to help us. And we really won this battle with his Kremlin cyber hackers. And of course, it was huge surprise to everybody. And now we have, using our experts starting from the Georgia, from the Ukraine, and we are trying to teach them. And of course, we got after this event and these cyber attacks, we got a lot of volunteers, and they volunteered to our National Guard volunteer and built special units of the cyber defense. And of course, it has developed now. Estonia is running the Nato Cyber Defense Center in Tallinn, and cyber defense has been now integral part of Estonian defense forces. So a lot of even young people, when they will become conscripts, they can go to these units of the cyber defense, and a lot of young people are using this. Some people are soon making their school practice of the cyber defense there, because it's becoming more and more important part in Estonia. Because looking to the modern world, I am afraid that the cyber defense is becoming more and more important there.
So our next question, it has a little bit of an introduction that I'll read here before it gets to the question. It says, I was born in Sweden and grew up there. I had an Estonian father And he was in Metsavenad, but escaped to Sweden. He died when I was young. I now work in Wisconsin. We never doubted or gave up the dream of the resurrection of the Estonian Republic. The Swedes never believed us. Mart Laar is my hero. He was the young prime minister, still with all the vision, who guided Estonia into Western Europe where it belongs. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. And then he goes on to ask, what is your advice for Ukraine? Do you believe they need to follow Estonia and make a more decisive break with the past? And do you believe that now a major invasion of Ukraine will be the end of Putin?
First of all, I must say that I personally, of course, I don't see to the minds of Putin, and probably nobody does. But I personally don't believe that he actually is ready to attack somebody. I am like Ukraine president who doesn't believe this either. I must say he wants all the West to be just really scared and to acknowledge that Putin is a great leader and everybody must come to Moscow and thank him and to talk with him and what the world is successfully doing currently. But I must say the Ukrainians must really continue this what they are doing now, that is to live their normal life. I think for me the best example was that yesterday in Kiev were massive demonstrations and against the government decision to start to use not the checkbooks but the machines to really to not let such an underground business going on. And of course, all small businesses were against this because it demands some money to go there, but it's very necessary. But I know I have done it in Estonia, and I think it's a very necessary idea. And I have suggested at least to one prime minister in one other country to do the same thing, and there it has worked really excellently. And Ukraine is doing just, I think, currently moving to the very right path. It's very very much working on the side to fight against the corruption, to fight against the oligarch power, and to really to have the country with so less corruption as possible, because the corruption is one of the most bad enemies of the market economy. When you're corrupted, you never can get the market economy because the market works only there where there is no corruption. They really can freely work. And I think the corruption is really like a cancer. I think that's one of the diseases against what all the Western world must fight.
So, Prime Minister, you seem to place the EU as of great importance for Estonian success and recovery. Our question asker here asks, says they're curious what you see as the greatest shortcoming or failure of the EU in relation to Estonia.
Our relations are really excellent. So that's one of the first questions, but I never can really not answer, I must say, because in the European Union, the first important thing to understand is that even when the European Union is doing some mistakes, this is unfortunately our mistake too, because we have been part of all decisions. But when you talk the things what I want to that Europe can make better is to be really more decisive. And that's one of the area where I think there is a lot of room to move yet.
So our next question here asks, how do you think of NATO, and why does it seem that NATO makes Russia feel unsafe or threatened?
I think just look what the Putin is talking, and then it's seen directly. And when somebody has why is NATO necessary, then look on all these threats of Putin on the neighboring countries, and then I think everybody understands why NATO is so necessary.
Next, what are your thoughts on the relationship between native Estonians and the Russians who were sent into Estonia as Estonians were sent to Siberia? Did many of the Estonians in Siberia return to Estonia when Estonia left the Soviet Union?
No, not I can. They are not very many by size. There are a lot of people who have sown their roots in Siberia, so they have stayed there. But many have returned too, and of course they are similar citizens of Estonia like everybody else. So no difference and no problems what I found, or at least and even not from Siberia, also from Abkhazia and so on. Many Estonian families who have lived there and who are still alive after the Sovietization, because you must remind that during the Soviet time, during Stalin time, all these people, Estonians by origin, were claimed the enemies of people, and so a huge part of them were just deported or directly killed. So their fate is not is even it may be even harder, maybe, as it is what happened with Estonians in Estonia.
Our next question says, best greetings from Madison, South Dakota. Wishing you a happy upcoming Independence Day of Estonia. As a former advisor of you in Estonian Parliament, I would like to today for your advice. What should U.S. Estonians do to more help secure the Estonian political situation under new Russian threats?
No, we doesn't feel threatened just now, of course, but this largely this work what we have done, and it's quite safe to live inside NATO, and especially when we compare how the people must live outside of NATO currently. And but what the Israel community can do always also is to talk, and not only for us, but to talk with together with other communities, especially currently the Ukrainians, because the fight for Ukrainian independence is a fight also for Estonian independence, and to stop the possible bad ideas what Mr. Putin can have in Ukraine will support very strongly also the security in all regions. And every work and every bit of information what you can give here and to develop the word and information about Estonia and about the region is very highly necessary.
So we're almost out of time here, but I wanted to sort of end by asking a more general question of, really two more general questions of what do you think makes a good leader, and do you have any advice to pass on to future leaders and aspiring leaders?
I think the first thing what I have mentioned several times here is to have courage. I think that's one of the most important things, because without courage you are lost absolutely. And of course, there are a lot of other second things when we talk about no more precisely on education and about this, what you must study now to become the strong leader. But it's hard to understand. But first of all, is to really to develop in you the skills to be really decisive, to make decisions, because it's always thousand reasons why not to decide something. There are a lot of very wise people who give always advice to decide, and it's always unpopular. And you are always, when you are decisive in situations when you can lose your position. But in the politics, you must always remember that you will always lose your position in the politics. Nobody, when it's not the President Putin who will stay in the president office forever, can stay there forever. And President of United States or Prime Minister of any other country, they never can stay there forever. Sometimes, always, moment comes when you're out, and it's a lot of better to be out when you then look back on your road and you feel that you are really done something, and you will always remember all these things what you have done, and never these things what you have not done, at least positively.
Well, I'm afraid we'll have to end the discussion there. Prime Minister, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you again for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you and all success.
I also wanted to thank, again, the Center for European Studies, as well as the staff at the Thompson Center for making this event possible. And of course, to all of you for joining us and for your wonderful questions. I hope you will join us again next week for our next event in this series, when we will be speaking with Anne Applebaum on the Cold War leadership of Pope John Paul II. Cecilia Klingel, a professor at the University of Wisconsin Law School, will be interviewing Ms. Applebaum. That event will be on Wednesday, February 23rd at 7 p.m. For more information on that and other events, please go to our website at thompsoncenter.wisc.edu.